Date point: 8th year, 11th month, 1st week, BV. Redemption: in orbit above the Class 3 planet Perfection. Dear Journal, 5 weeks, 4 days. Docking the shuttle in the now empty cargo bay 1, I jumped to the deck before the ramp was even halfway down, walking quickly. Heading for the quarters I had been given after P2's theft of the Phantom, I ran into Severus coming from the ship's bridge. What happened? Why are you back so soon? Did you get what you wanted? For the first time in weeks, I heard something that might have been hope in his voice. I made the appointment, I said, not bothering to slow, forcing Severus to drop behind me. Several aspects of the meeting changed. The plan was adapted, and now I need to be on a ship that will be requesting docking permission with the Redemption in several minutes. You're leaving? Why? What happened? The hope was gone, replaced by despair and confusion, though the latter was probably there by default. I don't have the time to explain the details, I growled, snatching up my fusion scimitars and twin blade. I hadn't taken them with me to the meeting, as that had been specifically prohibited. Besides, I hadn't finished making a sheath for the twin blade, being somewhat of a novice at crafting. I wouldn't have had any way of easily carrying it. Just holding it now, I slung the double sheath on my back. I also held on to the robe. A few cuts and it would actually fit quite nicely. It was a good robe. I need you to go back to the bridge and make sure nothing goes wrong with the docking. But you haven't told me why, the blue giraffe gasped, grabbing my arm. What happened? Why are you leaving? What are we supposed to do? Pulling my arm away, he stumbled forward, and I grabbed the back of his neck, forcing his eyes to a level with mine. Look, and for once in your life listen. This close to his face, I dropped my voice to a whisper. In order to get the information, Vagno is making me do something for her, and she wants me to do it with her own ship and crew. They'll be here any minute, and I'm going to leave with them. I'll be back as soon as I can, since I need to come back for the information. If you move this ship out of the system while I'm gone, I will hunt you down and take it from you. As for what you should do, I don't give a flying fuck. Just stay in system. Understand? Eyes wide, Severus nodded vigorously, blessedly silent. Releasing his neck, I swept from the room. I needed to find Manny and had barely any time. Guessing his location, I headed for engineering. He'd been spending more and more time helping out there, using his newly repaired Hulk suit to help patch systems P2 had indirectly damaged by his kamikaze run. My guess was correct, and I quickly moved up to him before he could get away. Was he really avoiding me? After telling him the shortest version of events possible, I gave him the bad news. You're not allowed to come with me. Vagno specifically stated I was not allowed to bring anyone with me, and only things I could carry. I suspect she's using this task as something of a test to gauge my abilities. Manny grunted. He'd never been talkative, and lately it had been hard to get more than a sentence or two out of him. I'll be back as soon as I can. Don't die, I said in a farewell, moving to leave. Same goes for you, he murmured. I'd paused. He'd never before expressed any wishes for my safety that I could remember, although I'd always assumed he thought I didn't need any. Shaking myself back into action, I continued out of engineering. Calling up internal communications, I contacted the bridge. Severus, they here yet? Starting docking procedures now, came the reply. They should be there by the time you reach the airlock. Good. Remember what I said. No reply came that time, but I knew he had heard, as the comm leak terminated several moments later. I stepped into the docking bay just as the starboard airlock opened to admit a hulking machine. I stopped dead, thinking that, as impossible as it was, the mutant had come to me. But a moment later my mind registered what my eyes were seeing. The being was entirely clad in a mechanical suit, except for the neck and head, or maybe it was just the head. There seemed to be no clear cut-off for where the throat ended and the head began, giving the impression of a worm. Considering what I could see, the rest of the body, large and powerful, was impressive. Maybe the suit was somewhat larger than the thing inside it, like Manny's Hulk suit. Judging by your expression, you've never seen Alabanolan before, the being said smugly. Before you come aboard, I want to make sure one thing's clear. Vacno picked me because I'm one of the best. I've beaten humans before, and you'd be no different. If you try to strong-arm me into anything, you'll be thrown in the brick. If you kill any one of my crew, I'll kill you. Vacno said I was to watch you and report back. Well, that answered the question of this being a test or not. So even if you survive this, and I don't like you, you'll still end up on her bad side. Any questions? Just one. Who are you exactly? I asked, trying to put as much scorn as I could into my voice. I was doing this mission for the information. I didn't give a damn about impressing this weirdo or his boss. His smug smile was replaced by a sneer. Denstar, came the terse reply. Right, never heard of you. Where are my quarters? Not waiting for a response, I walked past him into the small airlock. It was too narrow for him to pass me, so he was forced to fall behind. If he had been a human, I was sure I'd have heard teeth grinding. Grom, we'll show you where you're staying. Desna spat behind me. But don't get too comfortable. It won't take us long to attract a hunter vessel in this ship. Now, out of the hatch and free from the restrictive airlock, the robo-wormhead walked down the corridor to my left, leaving me standing in the empty hallway. He met you not 30 seconds ago and already hates you. Someone spoke from behind my right shoulder. If nothing else, that's an achievement. Not one I'd personally want, but I guess you'll take what you can. Turning, I saw another robo-wormhead I hadn't seen upon entering for the airlock, which was odd since he was rather hard to miss. Maybe his suit helped him blend in with the bulkheads. Are you Grom? I asked, ignoring his jibe. That I am. I'm here to show you to your quarters, although judging by your size you'd fit comfortably in a storage locker. Seemingly oblivious to my glare, Glom moved down a different hallway than the one Desna had taken. The ship, I decided, was also a cargo ship. I hadn't gotten a look at it from the outside, but as we moved down the long corridor, I saw doors with similar markings and spacing that I had seen on the Redemption. Aside from the fact that they were the same kind of ship, though, there was little else in common between this vessel and the one I just left. The most marked difference was the lighting. Every light in the Redemption had given a soft, light blue glow, several shades closer to white than the blue giraffe's own skin tone. Now that I thought about it, I had always found the light rather soothing. Except recently, that was. It had taken on a mockingly cheerful tone after Mama's death. This new cargo ship's lighting fit my mood much better. The lights themselves were orange, yet dim to the point of inefficacy, managing only to spread shadows throughout the ship's hallways. The corridors themselves were also different. Whereas the Redemption featured an architecture of boxes, with box rooms, box halls, and box consoles, the hallway Glom led me through featured more of a cylindrical shape, the ceiling sloping into the wall which melted into the floor, the only flat surface to be seen. Even the turns were rounded, the hallway winding through the ship rather than the sharp, 90-degree turns of the Redemption. The differences were unsettling. I had always disliked new places. Glom suddenly stopped, and I only just kept myself from running into him. That would have just been great, the fearsome human warrior too busy gaping at the hallways to watch where he was going. The robo-wormhead seemed not to notice, for which I was thankful, and gestured to the door in front of us. That's your room. I'm going to assume I don't need to show you how to work the faucet. If you have any questions, I prefer you didn't come to me, but I'm a better choice than Desna. Supposing there was no better invitation, I asked a question I'd had since Denstar had left me. Speaking of the captain, I said, halting Glom as he turned to leave. He said we wouldn't be having any problems attracting a hunter attack in this ship. Why the emphasis? What makes this ship so special? Several things, Glom replied, seeming not to mind the question. First is this ship's size. It's about as big as a cargo ship can get before it becomes a merchant cruiser. To hunters, that means lots of bodies for food. Second is the cargo. Reactors, FDL drives, ship weapons, all the kinds of things that are hard to get enough of when your people build their ships by recycling ones they've stolen. We're going to fly right through a lane that's infamous for hunter attacks. Dominion had difficulties policing it before the war. Now you're likely to see a cruiser or destroyer more than once or twice a cycle. This ship's a little too large for a single hunter ship to take on its own. I guess whoever's holding Desna's leash. If you know, keep it to yourself, I don't want it, Glarm interjected as I opened my mouth to tell him of Vacno. They're figuring that as long as we're actually looking for a hunter attack, we might as well clear up that lane while we're at it. This ship has all its stealth systems removed, even the ones that just make it hard to get a good long-distance sensor lock. Any hunter in the area will see us coming from light years away, and be able to tell exactly how big we are and what we're carrying. We'll draw all the hunters in the sector with this ship. I scowled, glaring at Glom. Great, so not only am I going to have to protect you guys from a hunter attack, I'm protecting you from a hunter horde. By the time I'm done, I'll be so exhausted I won't be able to finish the mission. What do you mean you'll have to protect us? Glom laughed. You never seen a Alabanolan before? When we're wearing heavy combat suits like these... He gestured to his metal frame. The only way for us to die by a kinetic pulse is if our personal barrier's down and we take a headshot. We're the best hunter repulsion team you could want. You'll go do your thing, and we'll take care of the rest. He finished with a cocky grin. If anything, my scowl deepened. If you're so powerful against the hunters, and this ship's been stripped of all its sensor penetration countermeasures, then won't they see this ship is full of you guys and decide not to attack? Nope, Glam responded, smile widening. Alabanolan aren't really known as traders, and by that I mean we don't trade at all. So I doubt many hunters have even seen one of us, let alone fight one. Even if they know what we are, our suits are giving off fake biosigns. We'll look like a bunch of Tormix to their sensors. Even when they're eating our return fire, the sensors will be telling them they're looking at Tormix, he said, the last sentence with a laugh. He did sound far more used to violence than many Xenos I'd seen, at least in the civilian theatre. His attitude reminded me more of what was common among members of the 74th. Another question nagged at the corners of my mind. Your suits seem really powerful, I admitted, which makes me kind of wonder why I never saw one of you in the war. And believe me, I would have. Glam's incessant smile took on a skeptical note. The war? You want me to believe you were there? I don't know much about your kind, but I can't see you getting along with the rest of the recruits and joining without a hitch. Something of an exception was made in my case, I growled. Answer my question. The tone wiped the smile from his face. Alabanolan don't answer to the Dominion. We take orders from the Directorate. We act as their muscle, and they make sure we don't get dragged into pointless border brawls. Don't ask me how they get away with it. I'm no politician. I just make a point of knowing where the favours are coming from, so I know to point my gun in the other direction. With that final statement, he turned on his heel. Though his posture hadn't changed, I felt for sure his back was stiff with anger. Shame. He'd almost seemed halfway decent. Shrugging, I entered my quarters. They were functional. Lit as dimly as the rest of the ship, I could still make out a bed and table, both made to fit against the room's curved walls, as well as the entrance to a small bathroom, and a doe-sphere dispenser, complete with water trough near the door. Having nothing better to do, I grabbed a few doe-spheres, placed my twin blade on the table, and set to work on the rope with my lava scimitars. Once I had it fit to my liking, I sat on the bed, bored. Opting out of spending the remainder of the flight in that way, I decided it was a good time to annoy Denster again. Calling up the ship's internal comms, I waited until his exasperated mutterings answered my call. This had better be important, human. I'm bored, I proclaimed loudly. I feel like exercising. Is there any way I could go to increase the gravity? You're bothering me because you're bored? He nearly screamed. I'll stop if you just answer my question, I replied simply. The link was cut with an infuriated curse. I decided that meant I could do it wherever. I would have just done it in my room, but it was small and I didn't want to accidentally cut something I was going to sleep on. This was a cargo ship, which I was used to, so I set out to find a cargo bay. Several minutes later, I was twirling my twin blade, movements quicker than they'd been in months, maybe years. The heavier gravity once again a familiar, comfortable pull. After more than a month of continuous exercising, I could tell the difference. When I met the mutant again, he wouldn't find me so easy a fight. For now, though, the hunters would do. Besides, I was eager to test the twin blade. Many had asked me a while back why I'd been twirling the pipe. I had told him I was thinking of getting a twin blade, and so was going through one of the exercises I'd learned during marching band. By far, the least proud moment of my life. I joined marching band in high school for a crush. Unfortunately, I couldn't play any instruments, so I joined the colour guard. It was boring, twirling a flag, but I spiced it up by pretending it was a weapon rather than a piece of cloth I was spinning around. Now, I was grateful for the experience. I doubt I'd win any technique awards, but I could keep the blades in a continuous windmill about myself, which offered greater potential for inflicting damage than my lava scimitars had ever given. The blade itself had also been a pleasant surprise. I had merely expected a shaft with 2 blades on either side. What I received was a staff, a little more than a metre in length. My excitement came from the fact that the blades at each end were retractable, making for easier storage, and the addition of 2 smaller blades that had been added at the base of each main blade. When extended, the smaller blades popped out, serving as a hilt for each saw-bladed end, except with the ability to cut. Anything that increased the weapon's danger was fine by me. The other surprise had been its appearance. Dick had said black, but I hadn't expected it to look as though it were cut from obsidian. Its mirror shine gleamed with a hungry light when the white heat suffused its jewel edges. Though, look as I did at my reflection in the handle, I could only see my outline, not my features, making it look as though I lived in a world of silhouettes. I would have been lying if I said the thought didn't appeal to me. I practiced until a slow burn had worked its way into my arms. From there I ran, then crunched, and generally went about my usual routine. That, along with sleeping and eating, became my life for the next week or so. I was impatient, and I only managed to remain relatively calm because I knew I was actively working towards my goal, though it didn't feel like it. It was a welcome change when Densner summoned me to the bridge. "We're close," he stated curtly. "I don't think we'll need to wait long for them to strike. You ever been on the receiving end of a hunter attack?" "No." "Well, I'll give you the general rundown," he said, the scowl that he always wore around me deepening. "They don't bother using the airlocks. They just drop you out of warp with a gravity spike, latch onto the hull and cut their way in. That means that you don't really need to be in any particular part of the ship when they board, although I'd advise somewhere midship, just to make it easy to get to any. When they're through, take your pick and do your thing." "Wait," I protested. "Do I get some kind of weapon? Something I can use to incapacitate one of them without killing them?" "I hadn't thought you need anything like that, great human warrior," Densner replied, voice dripping sarcasm. "Though if you aren't as confident in your skills as I thought, I can have the doctor provide you with some injections that'll work." "That would be appreciated," I said, refusing to reward his insult with a response. Several minutes later, a robo-wormhead handed me 3 syringes filled with a clear liquid. No sooner had I placed them in my pocket than the bridge lights flashed to emergency green. Who the fuck thinks of using green as emergency lighting? And several consoles blew up with warning beeps and buzzes. With so much activity, robo-wormhead's words were hardly necessary. "Hunter ships to cloak in all sides, Captain. Boarding proboscis is extended. They're coming in." I didn't wait for Densner's permission to take my leave. Running towards engineering, the captain's voice went over the ship's speakers. "All hands to defensive positions. Let's show them how real warriors act." I arrived in engineering, almost the exact center of the ship, just as several sections of the wall started sporting glowing circles, heat coming off them in waves. Looking about the room, I saw robo-wormheads, one of them calm, tense, but not outwardly frightened, crouching in defensive positions, ready for the onslaught. Drawing my twin blade from the deepest pocket of my robe, it was a good robe, a low snarl of pleasure rumbled in my chest as the blaze extended, igniting with burning white heat. 3 seconds passed in an eternity. The ship heaved, glowing sections of the hull tearing from the walls in showers of sparks and the squealing protest of metal, twisted monstrosities, following in the wake of noise and confusion. Had Gorm had less training and experience in combat situations, he might have sat, transfixed, by the sheer repulsiveness of the creatures that burst through the newly created openings. As it was, his mind focused as it always did when he became frightened, tightening his grip on his kinetic pulse weapon, bringing it to his shoulder, and firing with smooth efficiency and deadly aim. All around him, Alabanolan defenders responded similarly, unleashing a deadly salvo of kinetic pulses against the cannibalistic pirates. The hunters, facing resistance but they had expected fear, faltered in their charge. Only for a moment though. Overcoming their surprise, their movements became similar to those of the defending warriors. The swaggering, arrogant surprise fighters was replaced by the short, deadly motions of born fighters. Garm felt the first flutters of worry. This was unexpected. The hunters were supposed to have been complacent, so used to the lack of resistance offered up by other species that their own fighting skills had atrophied as a result. Reality seemed to disagree. The human, however, was something else entirely. Sure, Garm had heard. He knew humans were inherently stronger and such, not because of anything they had done to deserve it. They were just born that way. Seeing a human in action, though, momentarily put all thoughts out of his mind. It was only a moment, because that was how much time passed before the human launched himself into one of the newly opened corridors, ploughing into a hunter as it tried to enter the ship. The black fusion twin blade ripped into the unfortunate creature, decapitating it. The human didn't stop though. Continuing through his victim, he crashed into the one behind it, then to the other one behind that hunter, a single jump carrying him through 3 enemies. Accompanying the small victory, the low growl emanating from the human grew in intensity, pulsing with a malicious glee. Hurling himself further down the boarding proboscis, Garm lost sight of him. His attention was soon reclaimed by the conflict as a pulse slammed into the kinetic barrier directly in front of his face. Then another, and another. Ducking back into cover, Garm took a deep breath. The hunter's aim, it seemed, was good enough to accomplish the headshot that would end even an Alabanolan's life once his kinetic barrier fell. Garm's small flutterings of worry grew into full trepidation. I hadn't been prepared for how nauseating those things looked. Bone white, clammy skin glistened on a 6-legged creature with 7 eyes. Cybernetics sprouted from odd places, irritating the skin around them to an inflamed pink. They looked like the Borg had bet the cave version of spider crabs with some help from Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft. I paused. That pause ended. Leap-flying into a hunter as it stepped into the ship, I used the twin blade like a spear, plunging it into the being's neck. The white-hot blade cut through the soft flesh like butter. Bereft of any resistance, my leap carried me past my opponent, through the one behind him, and into a killing stroke against the one behind him. The cramped boarding tube forced the creatures to form a line. Snarl growling in intensity, I flung myself into them. What I'd heard had been correct. These guys were just as weak as every other Xeno I'd meet. My sudden appearance had frozen them. They stood, transfixed, as I killed the first 3, and their inactivity lasted just long enough for me to take care of another 4 before they snapped out it. The few closest to me panicked, firing wildly. I easily dodged their wild attacks, but my luck ran out when I had them out of the way to clear a shot for the ones behind them. Firing through the failing kinetic barriers of the fallen brothers, and consequently through their tumbling corpses, I was hit in the chest. It had been a while since I was hit with heavy kinetic fire, although I wasn't going to complain since lately all I seemed to be finding were guys with anti-tank pulses. My growl of pleasure becoming a curse of anger, I flung myself against the tide walls of the proboscis, diving low to the ground, whipping out a lava scimitar and sliding through the nearest monster's legs. A quick roll and thrust of the twin blade later, I was in the ship proper, surrounded by a group of thoroughly surprised hunters, all awaiting their turn to travel down the slaughter tunnel and join the fray. Wasn't it just so polite of me to come to them? Here, the twin blade became invaluable. I needed to move fast. Even if all they had were heavies in the way of kinetic pulse weapons, I could still be killed if enough of them hit me at once, or even just by one unlucky hit to the temple. With the scimitars, I needed to pause between each swing, as I redirected the energy I'd given it. With the twin blade, every swing was the wind-up for the next. Spinning it before me, I rushed into the group, keeping my head low, shoulders hunched, and trajectory unpredictable. The twin blade was definitely living up to my hopes and expectations. It afforded further reach, quicker recoveries after strikes, and the heart provided a bar with which I could smash enemies out of my way. It didn't seem to matter that I didn't technically know how to use it. It was perfectly sufficient out here with these beans of cardboard. After all, I'd been training with it to take on a being of true strength. What hope did these feeble souls have? Searing through flesh, the mirror surface of the dual blades gleamed savagely, rending limbs, torsos, and cybernetic implants with equal ease. Tearing through foe after foe, it seemed alive in my hands, straining to kill. Twirling from one enemy to another, reaching to include multiple targets with every strike, raining death around me. It felt good. The anger and frustration I'd held barely under control, I now let freely flow. The guilt I felt over allowing pain to keep me from helping Mama. The anger at the mutant's almost casual movements as he brushed her life away. I didn't worry that I'd use it all up before I got to the mutant. There was plenty to go around. I released it from my limbs and into my blades as I threw myself against the hunters, and they died. I realized after several moments that I was slaughtering a corpse. A bloody pulp lay at my feet as I minced the already small remnants into an even finer mist. I stopped, looking around me. Blood, the blackish purple of a new bruise, was splashed over the walls. Sometimes my twin blade hadn't been in the right position, so I'd resorted to kicking, which left a considerably greater mass than the cauterizing heat of the sword. A thump came from behind. I whirled around, saw a hunter from a side hallway emerge into the newly cleared room. I charged. The Delta peered into the room, where only moments ago so many cries of pain and confusion had echoed through the cybernetic channels. Now all it heard were questions, queries asking what had happened. The Delta now saw, and the sight left it frightened enough to where his fear was even broadcasted over the channels, drawing even the Alpha's attention to him. It felt as if the Alpha tapped into his visual stream, seeing what the Delta saw. It spoke of the Alpha's discomfort, that it would allow itself to look through the eyes of a lowly Delta, such as itself. As the Delta crept further into the boarding bay, the only living creature in the room spun around. Binocular vision locked onto the hunter, and with it, the Delta knew he was looking into the eyes of another predator, one that put even the Alpha to shame. A single moment passed as it gazed into the burning inferno that flared in the creature's eyes. Then the Delta added its own cry of pain to the neural network. Contemptuously battering aside the single hunter on my way by, I flew down the corridor he'd exited. I took a left, then a right, another right, and then a left. I didn't come across another group, but I was going fast. I didn't know how many hunters this ship had, or how many were left after my entrance. Deviating from my hallway, I turned and passed through a side door. I felt the temperature change instantly, though it might have just been from my own shock. Bodies, hanging in suspension pods attached to the ceiling, upside down, frozen. Aliens whose species I'd never seen before, let alone knew the name of. Others whose species I painfully did know, and had names with too many consonants and not enough vowels for me to pronounce. Some of those bodies were too small to be fully grown. Manny's words about how these creatures ate people struck home in a terrible way. A new source of anger flared. Before I'd been working off of borrowed hatred, now I had a different reason to want to see these bastards dead. My grip tightened on the haft of the twin blade. Turning, I continued down the corridor just as the pack entered from a side hall further up. Roaring a challenge, I crushed the leader's throat with the twin blade's handle and spun, leading the blades in a pirouette that tore several heads and chests. They were weirdly similar, heights and general physiological build appearing nearly identical. Whether this meant they were clones or there was just little genetic diversity, I didn't know. All it meant for me was that their necks were all about the same height of the ground. I knew I wasn't thinking. I was supposed to capture one of these, but so far all I'd done was do my best to see how many pieces I could cut one into with as few strikes as possible. But knowing one thing and actually wanting to stop myself were two completely different things. The rage was intoxicating. For a vision hazed with red, I watched meat and tendons sizzle and snap as the blades slid through them, the intense heat magnifying the pain. If I could have made it hotter, I would have. If I could have hurt them more, I'd have taken the time. I could only kill them once, though, and they were too fragile to endure the torture they deserved. Time lost its meaning. I don't know how many I killed or how long it took. I only knew that I was angry. I was invincible, untouchable, and unstoppable. I was the inexorable wave that would end them, the fate they had brought upon themselves. I was their judge and executioner. I was in freefall. All my unstoppable momentum traceably turned against me as the gravity unexpectedly shut off, catching me in the middle of a jump. Rather than the long, arcing, devastating leap I had assumed, I continued upon my initial trajectory, which was straight into the ceiling. I barely got my hands in front of my face in time to keep my head from smashing into a bulkhead. My less than graceful impact was still enough to jar me from the unthinking berserker state I'd hardly realized I'd entered. As though coming out of a trance, I looked around me. I was on the bridge, or above it as the case was. The ceiling was higher than it had been in the corridors, which was the only reason I'd had enough time to narrowly avoid a concussion. My attention immediately refocused to the other side of the room, as the figure, still standing on the floor, seemingly unaffected by the lack of gravity, chucked a small, dreadfully familiar grey disc in my direction. Nerve jam grenade. Kicking off the bulkhead that had nearly beheaded me as I shot towards the grenade, whipped out Lava Scimitar 1, and cut the deadly neural disruptor neatly in two. Looking up, I saw 3 more headed my way. I couldn't reach them in time. They were fanned out, growing further apart from each other as they flew through the air, yet still all heading towards my side of the room. I was still gliding at a weird angle, my line of motion swiftly, though not swiftly enough, taking me to a point on the floor well within the blast radius of all 3 charges. Thinking fast, first time for everything, I chucked my twin blade like a spear, though not at any one of the oncoming grenades. Instead, I threw it at the ceiling, accelerating my downward motion through opposite reactions, giving me the speed necessary to reach the floor. I hit and rebounded as quickly as I could, trying to mimic what I've seen professional swimmers do. What I managed wasn't really graceful, but it got the job done after a fashion. My trajectory corrected. I shot towards the entrance, trying to stay away from my attacker and his deadly barrage. I cleared the blast radius, sort of. I heard several deadly clicks behind me, and my vision flashed a whole different shade of red that faded to black for a few moments. A wave of pain crashed into me, feeling like my brain was Athena and I Zeus. My vision returned with my senses, and it took a moment to reorient myself. I used another moment to take in my surroundings. I was lying on the floor of the corridor just before the entrance to bridge, which appeared to be the only room affected by the lack of gravity. Looking behind me, I saw my twin blade stuck into the ceiling of the bridge where I'd thrown it, slowly heating the metal around it into a glowing radius of light. The next thing I noticed was the carnage. Hunter bodies lay everywhere, even in the bridge. Dismembered bodies spinning slowly through the air, blackish purple blood softly flowing out into the room. Then I got a look at my attacker. It was another hunter, but this one was different. I was almost certain it was larger than most of the others I'd seen, and I was positive it had more cybernetic implants. I looked down at his feet. The end of each of his 6 legs ended in some mechanical addition, 4 of which held onto the floor through some mechanism other than gravity, allowing it to move with a semblance of normalcy, despite being in freefall. My suspicions were confirmed as it walked up the wall, onto the ceiling, and right next to my twin blade, liberating it from the bulkhead. Spinning it experimentally several times, it turned its 7-eyed gaze towards me. I have a death wish. I probably could have killed him right there. I still held Lava Scimitar 1 in my right hand, and Lava Scimitar 2 was safely in its sheath on my back. I could have just chucked it at him, and his slow reflexes would have taken care of the rest. And believe me, despite his size and the apparent leadership role he fulfilled, call it a hunch, he was still slow. After he was dead, which, with my throwing skills, would probably mean ending up with the hilt stuck in his face rather than the blade, I could have found some easier, smaller prey to subdue with the syringes in my pocket, or at least one that wasn't currently twirling my twin blade in front of them. But I didn't want to find some hunter else. I suddenly knew I wanted to bring this guy back to Vacno. Not just because I still had a headache from his nerve jam salvo, but because he thought to use my twin blade against me. The hunter soon to be mine disengaged whatever was keeping him secured to the ceiling, pushed off, and glided gracefully to the floor. At least, that's what would have happened, had I not intercepted him halfway down with a 0G tackle. Rather than smashing into him linebacker style, I made sure to catch him around the chest instead, so as to keep him intact. He tried to bring the twin blade around, but I was well inside his reach. My momentum drove us towards a wall, carrying him along in a bear hug. As a side note, hugging a hunter is about as disgusting as it sounds. My face buried against his cold, moist chest. It was like hugging a corpse. I reached around him and used my hands to soften our impact against the wall. It'd have been just great, after going through so much trouble to not kill him, to crush him against the bulkhead. He was still struggling to bring one of his leg guns or twin blade against me, but just as we hit the wall he switched strategies. The first I knew about it was when I felt dozens of sharp twisting pains in the back of my neck. The true nature of my situation crashed into me when I felt a warm, dank draft on the nape of my neck that raised goosebumps all over my body. He had bitten me, and it hurt. It didn't seem strong enough to stab my neck, though not for a lack of trying. The moment he scored his first hit, the hunter went batshit crazy, biting again and again. I was still making sure I didn't accidentally kill him as I spun around and kicked off the wall towards the ground, dragging him with me. Clawing a syringe out of my robe, I jammed it into his chest and pressed a release, draining the contents into him. TV lied. You always see evil doctors stabbing people in the neck with a needle full of something malicious and green, after which the effect of whatever diabolical substance was just injected takes hold of the victim instantly. That's not what happened to my biting hugs like a corpse friend. He just kept right at it, struggling even more frantically, chomping his little heart away. I could feel blood pouring down my shoulders and neck. I guess I was lucky he couldn't bend enough to get my head. Deciding that hugging him may not have been the best idea, I let go, took out the other two syringes, and stabbed both into his two nearest legs. That got his attention. Not only because I guess it hurt a lot more than the first one, but because I'd also just moved into striking range of my twin blade. I raised Lava Scimitar 1 to parry an anticipated strike, but it never came. Like a cat fed on a diet of pure catnip, he surged forward in a frenzy, legs straining to reach the floor so he could move in freefall. Wide open maw leading his charge. Did I really taste that good? My scimitar, moved to block what would have been a logical response from a psycho hunter, was out of position to stop him, so I decided that if he was playing dirty, I could too. My feet were still above my head, which was pointed at an oblique angle of the floor as I stared at the oncoming rows of teeth. As he came up to meet me, I struck. Letting go of my scimitar, I grabbed both sides of his head, pulling it up and to the side of me, putting the arm holding my twin blade right in front of my face. Opening wide, I bit him back. My teeth went through his skin like overcooked chicken, knocking against the bone, which broke. Rather than crackling like a bone's supposed to, it shattered with the sound of breaking glass. I had other things to worry about. Hugging a hunter feels awful. Tasting one was without a doubt the worst decision I've ever made. I doubted a vulture could have stomached it. Cold and moist, the meat turned to mush in my mouth, blood like motor oil mixed with rancid oil squirting out my lips. Soon, all I tasted was bile, as every taste bud unanimously decided that whatever I subjected them to was worth ejecting everything I'd eaten the last 3 days. As a torrent exploded from my mouth, I was pushed away from Jaws to where I could see his face. I never before realized that hunters had different facial expressions. 7 eyes, and an oddly shaped mouth make them difficult to read, but I suppose I'd only ever seen them in one emotional state. Now, however, his face was completely different. All 7 of his eyes popped, making him appear twice their normal size. Mouth gaping like a fish's out of water. His legs floated, limp, completely immobile. It didn't even seem to care about the e-cure, leaking like hydraulic fluid from his nearly severed arm. We hung suspended in that pose for an entire minute. I fighting a fierce internal battle to keep my stomach acid on the inside. Him drifting, staring, petrified, in what could have been a combination of shock and horror. After a little while longer, I realized he was too still. That and the flow from his arm had lessened in a way that suggested a significantly slower heartbeat. The overdose of sedatives had finally taken effect. Getting my still roiling insides under tenuous control, I took stock of my situation. My shoulders were a bloody mess, covered in scabs and sharp pains. Despite his teeth, though, none of the wounds were as deep as they could have been, though an alarming number were still leaking blood. My neck was similarly encrusted with oozing wounds. Judging by the fact that I was still alive, Jaws had missed my carotids, jugulars, and subclavian arteries during his ferocious, though thoroughly second-rate, feeding frenzy. Other than my upper body and a few nicks on my back where his mouth, angled incorrectly, hadn't been able to find a purchase for his teeth, I was surprisingly okay for a guy who had gotten the business end of a hunter. Through careful manoeuvring and a boost from Lava Scimitar 2, I got to the ship's tactical control console, which had nearly the same configuration as all the others I'd worked with. Xenos. Weak and, in many ways, inept, but they know how to standardize. Returning the gravity to Galactic Standard, I used the sensors to see how the robo-worm heads were handling their side of the bargain. I froze when the results came through. The cargo ship was crawling with hunters. The only Tormig's life signs came from the bridge, surrounded by enemies. The robo-worm heads were putting up a good fight. Even as I watched, several hunters' vitals went dead, but there were too many. The foe Tormigs were going to lose as it was, fighting what was easily 20-1 odds. The hunters had far too few survivors remaining, considering the number of ships involved in the attack. Yet they still numbered well over 100. They swarmed over the cargo ship, looking like flies on a beached whale. I started preparing reasons against going back to help the survivors, but stopped several moments later. I didn't feel the need. The drive to save them from the hunters hadn't come. I didn't care about the robo-worms or the hunters. They weren't my target. A nagging suspicion told me something was wrong with the situation, but a sudden lightheadedness silenced the voice. Blood was still dripping from my injuries, sliding down my back and staining my front. It was slow, but persistent, coming from the deeper wounds I'd sustained. The hunters were busy with their prey, their ships virtually empty. I had my own ship, and I knew how to drive it with decent proficiency. Opting to disconnect the proboscis rather than take the time to retract it, I disengaged the clamps, leaving it and the doomed cargo ship behind. Engaging the cloak as soon as I figured out how, I went in search of the medical bay, dragging Jaws behind me. I had to lessen the gravity 3 times before I got there, my legs feeling leaden, and the oversized, unconscious hunter increasing in weight with every minute. With relief, I noted a familiar dispenser. Walking over to the Instaclot foam stuff I seen medics carry through my time with the 74th, I applied liberal amounts to my neck and shoulders. When I finished with myself, there was nothing I wanted to do more than lie down on the floor and sleep. Instead, I forced my head, still complete with headache, to figure out what to do with Jaws. It'd be just like my luck for him to wake while I was still asleep, and that was a situation I avidly wished to avoid. Several dull moments dragged on as I tried to force a solution for my sluggish mind. It finally surrendered an answer, and I lurched into motion, picked up Jaws once again, and started off towards the room I'd seen on my way in. I got and turned around, and honestly the doors all looked the same, but I found the meat locker after several minutes. Even the control console and the stasis pods had similarities to the ones I was familiar with, and after a small amount of effort, which to my quickly fading faculties felt like entirely too much, I settled Jaws into his own little refrigeration unit, face still frozen and an expression of shocked disbelief, set to wake only upon specific command. I still wanted to sleep, but I wasn't going to do it in a room full of dead and suspended bodies. I went back to the bridge, made sure my course was correct, gathered my weapons from their various locations about the room, then slumped against an oddly shaped stool in the middle of the room, falling asleep instantly.